Welcome everyone to the BioTools Innovator webinar series for our 2021 season. This is a little bit of background about what we do here. So first off, I'm Catherine Zavala. I'm the Managing Director for BioTools Innovator. We are purpose-built to support life science tools and diagnostics companies that are developing technologies to improve human health. Our weekly webinar series features leading voices in our industry to provide unique insight and guidance, not just to our cohort, but also to the public elsewhere. The first 60 minutes of this will be live streamed on YouTube, and then we will go into a private chat with our cohort companies for the last 30 minutes. Today's topic is the all-important and always relevant topic of product development and manufacturing. With that, I'll hand this over to our host for today, which is Ayelet Marom, our Program Director.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we're really happy to be able to have our two panelists here with us today to discuss product development and manufacturing and hear some advice from our experts. So let me introduce them briefly, and then I'll let them each introduce themselves a little bit more in depth. So we have Ryan McGuinness. Hi, Ryan. He's the Commercial General Manager for Triple Ring Technologies. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have Oliver Dick with us. He's the CEO of Miltenyi Biotec and the founder of Odicon, a consulting firm. So thank you so much, Oliver, for joining us as well. And I'm going to let you each introduce yourself a little bit more in depth and tell us about also your background in life science tools. So how about we start with Ryan?
Okay. Thank you, Ayelet, and thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. Yeah, my name is Ryan McGuinness. I wear a couple of hats at Triple Ring. I'm the Commercial General Manager, but also the practice area lead for our In Vitro Technologies group. And that's the group dedicated to that intersection of biology and technology. I am a technical person by background. I'm a molecular cell biologist. I've been in life sciences and med device for many, many decades, too many. And I started out in cell and gene therapy in the first go round 30 years ago. And then did cell and gene therapy, biotherapeutics, cellular therapeutics, and then into working with engineers and hardware developers to build hardware for biomolecular screening assays. And then eventually that turned into med device, in vitro diagnostics, and that sort of thing. At Triple Ring, we are a co-development company. We stand side by side with innovators and inventors to bring complex systems products to market. So we can talk more about that as we go on, but thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And on to you, Oliver.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Ayelet. My name is Oliver Dick. I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer of Miltenyi Biotec here in Germany. I'm in the life science arena for almost 30 years now. Like Ryan, probably a bit too long. I started working for a US company, PAL, which is part of Dana here, and then worked a couple of years for Fresenius at a pharmaceutical company in Germany. I was the general manager of a CMO in therapeutics, Rentschler, and then worked 12 years for QIAGEN in Germany as the VP of manufacturing, responsible for worldwide activities before I left QIAGEN to become the CEO of Miltenyi. I'm an engineer by background in biochemical engineering. Made my PhD in large-scale fermentation processes. And I'm also founder of Odicon, which is a small consulting firm. I'm working there with life science companies, preferably with smaller companies, startup companies, growing companies, and give them some advice in setting up operations. That's me.
Thank you so much to both of you. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about your company and your organization, and how do you specifically engage with startups in the life science tools space, and more of a high level, if you have a high level advice on how to engage with a co-development company. We'll get into the details of it later, but more of a highlight. And we'll start with Oliver.
Yeah, so at Miltenyi today, I think we try to do many things ourselves, but we work, of course, with startup companies as well. We are interested mainly in new technologies. So if you work with larger companies, make sure that you show the extra value for the application that might be of interest for us, for instance. At QIAGEN, I think it was very similar. We usually try to acquire smaller companies at a stage where they had the first revenue, where the products were mature enough that we could leverage what QIAGEN offers. So global presence, global marketing, sales, good regulatory affairs department, and a lot of know-how how to bring products to the market. So that was what we were most interested in. From an operations perspective, we usually try to in-source activities of acquired companies very soon. So that was not the most important thing when we looked at our M&A strategy, where and how a product was manufactured.
All right, thank you. And Ryan.
Yeah, so triple ring is helpful and valuable in many, many ways for early stage companies. In fact, it's very much how we got started. Many of us who run the company come from startups or serial entrepreneurs, spent most of our lives in early stage companies. And so for product development, we go anywhere from a napkin sketch, a whiteboard brainstorming, all the way through to clinical prototypes, and all under design control and ready for FDA clearance. We are helpful in giving companies, early stage companies, a home. We have an incubator inside of our company. It's called Agility Labs. We have access to funds. We have programs where we have business where we can swap equity for services. And then we have this amazing ecosystem and network of not just supply chain, but also advisors, investors, talent. And so this are all the kinds of things that we've built up around the company to support innovation. That's what gets us out of bed in the morning. And then on the topic of how to engage, partner and be open. What people are trying to do these days, companies are trying to do, is extremely hard, and you can't do it alone. And so you've got to find a way to get good partners.
Great. This is a really perfect segue into the next question, really. What are some of the advantages or disadvantages of an early stage startup or a mid-stage startup to partner up with a product development firm versus doing things in-house? And what kind of question, if we get to the point that really we choose to partner with someone, what kind of questions should they be asking? What are the qualities they should be looking for in a partner? We'll start with you, Ryan, as you were already talking about this, and then move on to Oliver. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So the thing to realize is that, again, what we're trying to do is difficult. And you need at least, even at the earliest stage, a dozen different experts to help build even a modest complexity device, a diagnostic device or tool. And modern investors don't allow companies to staff up. The problem is that you can get a material scientist or a brilliant electrical engineer, and you only need them for a few months in the first couple of years. Now you're carrying all that overhead. And these are smart people. They're active, and when they're not busy, they cause problems. And I know this from personal experience. And so what you have to do is look for variable resourced, outsourced help. And that's the kind of thing that Triple Ring does. And as I say, most smart investors these days require that early stage companies partner in this way. It's capital efficient, makes a lot of sense. You're also no longer encouraged to go out and find your own space. There are plenty of incubators on the planet. Rather than pay for hallways and bathrooms and kitchens, you just pay for your bench. And that's where you start.
Oliver, on to
Yeah,
you.
I fully agree. I think at the beginning, the early, let's say, stages of a company's lifetime, you have to focus on what is really making the difference, right? On your technology, develop the product. And the first thing that I recommend is to look at your technology and then differentiate what makes that technology unique. What is the thing that can also create some IP later on? Also, when you look at manufacturing, for instance, is there any type of manufacturing IP that can be filed? And not waste resources with trying to build a GMP manufacturing facility, for instance, or try to invest in plastic molding or something. That is, from my perspective, waste of energy at the very beginning. Focus on what is really important to develop a company. Focus on time to market. Bring your product to the market, but not too early. So a thorough investigation of the manufacturing process is also very important, that you at the end have a reliable product that can be produced sustainably. So invest in those things, partner with companies that have certain know-how in that field, and try to focus on the really important things, and work with CMOs and contract development companies.
Yeah. I think part of the question was also, what do you keep close? And we always counsel that you keep the secret sauce close. If you really think about what your company is, many of them end up being software companies or data companies. And that's the kind of know-how that you want to keep it institutionalized. So you have that history behind what the core IP is, the core product is. Everything else, go find help for. It's much more.
We'll talk about IP a little bit later on with more specific questions, but any disadvantages you would see, despite what you were describing here, to partnering, or any vice versa advantages in going at it on your own?
Yeah, I personally see disadvantages more long-term. So there is a certain cost disadvantage long-term, because you always work with a CMO, and of course the CMO wants to have a margin, and that's fair. So it's a bit more expensive. And there might be also some dependency on know-how that is generated outside of your own company. And you need good contracts at the very beginning to have full transparency and have access to that know-how that's generated, for instance, in process development. Also, troubleshooting is something that might be affected when you have difficulties, when your product is first time on the market, and then you might have discussions who's responsible for the failure, and you waste some internal resources. And of course, you generate a lot of experience with your product, and that is partly then owned by the CMO as well, and it's sometimes difficult to get that back into the company at a later stage. So short time, would say there are a lot of advantages, cost-wise, time-wise. Long-term, I think an option to get this technology back into a company is a valuable thing to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. Ryan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot with what Oliver had said. The other thing is that at the early stages, there's a sharp learning curve for the founders and inventors. in most companies. And so you have to switch your mind from your technology into more of an operations person, and understanding how to interact with these other groups that are helping you out and do that efficiently. And it can take some time to work that out. And so a lot of these folks are brilliant scientists and engineers, totally focused on solving the problem that's in front of them, but they need to frame shift in order to be successful and figure out how to manage the full effort going along.
So let's go straight into the $1 million question, I guess, based on what you're saying here. What are some strategies that you can recommend to avoid these kind of things down the line, or to have really a successful partnership that is built on a solid foundation? What should companies, when they approach this kind of partnership, what should they really be looking at? What should they be asking, and how should they structure this kind of partnership? Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay. Yeah, find somebody you can trust, and then trust them completely. There are twists and turns in the road. The plan, product concept you start out with, in my now long experience, is almost never what you end up with. And so there are bumps in the road. And just like you would do, like when I was young and you'd build your own company and you build your own team, you would work through these problems. You've got to have a relationship with your outsourced help that is totally tied together. And so find the right partner that can do that, and be careful and take a lot of time to meet them, to start discussing things with them, check your network, because most of us know people that and find out how those experiences were. They're the nuts and bolts of finding the best fit that we can certainly help out with and suggest that you do. Do you have the right competencies? Do you have the right infrastructure? That sort of stuff is relatively straightforward. But building a relationship, not just amongst yourself and the contract work, but also with your investors and your advisors and those groups, so that you can be a cohesive unit and weather these bumps in the road effectively.
Thank you. Oliver.
Yeah, I fully agree. Trust is very important. Try to work with, let's say, strategic suppliers rather than work on a work order base. I give you an order and you give me your product or the service or whatever I order. So try to establish a long-term relationship. The other thing is work with first-class suppliers. So we often experience in the past that companies work with very small suppliers and were dependent on their know-how, and this is then a garage company rather than a first-class supplier, and creates a lot of problems, especially when you scale your business later on. So try to work with first-class suppliers. Another thing is avoid too much complexity. I also have seen companies that work with so many suppliers, different partners for each and every aspect. There might be chances to bundle services and work with larger organizations that can provide more than just one service. So keep the supply chain, for instance, lean, work with suppliers on the trust base, and work with first-class suppliers would be my recommendation.
Thank you. I think this is really important advice. Let's talk a little bit about the how. So some of our companies are asking, what are the different types of partnerships that you can engage in? And can you talk a little bit about that, and how, what are different models to that, how that look like? Oliver, go ahead.
Different models. Yeah, as I said, strategic cooperation. I think you have to be transparent what the target is. So if you want to develop a product, then make sure that everybody is aware of what is expected, what the final target is, and try to define some incentives, time-wise, cost-wise, performance-wise, what is it that you want to achieve in this magic triangle between quality, cost, and time, and try to define a common target for the entire team, including the suppliers, including the CDMOs, and try to define also some incentives for your partners so that they participate in your success, because they are at the end also crucial, key that you achieve your targets. And the other thing is long term. I think if you are interested in doing certain things later on yourself, like production or testing or distribution, then make sure that this is transparent from the very first moment on, and that you have some parts in your contract that highlight that there is an option to transfer, for instance, technology back in-house at a later point of time. Transparency is always the best thing here, that there are no surprises later on.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's really important what you were talking about, the triangle and the different considerations. This is something that really on everyone's mind, I think. Ryan, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I can get specific for triple ring, but it's common through the industry. A slightly uncommon thing is that we have this co-development business. Mm-hmm. And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, we trade or exchange equity in an early stage company for engineering services and R&D. Mm-hmm. And we can do that to a modest amount. And I can talk about that specifically with individuals and that kind of thing. But what it does is it does stretch the company's runway. It saves cash. And then it aligns our company with the startup. And we're very flexible in those terms. In terms of valuation, we can put it on a note out to another round. But across the industry, you'll find groups like ours that are very interested in being a trusted partner, being really close, because this is how innovation gets done, but it also helps everyone to grow these companies successfully. By and large, most of the work we do is time and materials, especially in the early stages of development, because it's a lot of invention is required, and it's impossible to put timelines and budgets on invention. So you need to be aware of that. But you do need to have a good, tight scope that we can work against. It helps to have a very experienced, VP of engineering or VP of R&D that's there living with the execution team to make sure that things are straight on for the corporate objectives on every single day and every single week. There's other models. If there's some low risk development work that needs to get done, it can be done on a fixed bid. And then there are other models where you can trade cost for downstream manufacturing. And you want to be careful about that type of thing, especially at the early stage, because you can get locked into a relationship that may be suboptimal later on. And many of these programs are quite early in the development cycle and have a lot of risk and will change. And so any assumptions you had around manufacturing are completely gone by the time you get there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's move on to talking about the when, which is also an important question in that aspect. So when is the right time to start thinking about these kind of partnerships? When is too early, and is there any advantage specifically to starting early on? Oliver.
So when I worked for Rentschler, we were approached by many companies that, from my perspective, came a bit too late. So I thought that some of the things that were already developed could have been done differently. And so I usually recommended to start very early on to work with development partners and manufacturing partners as well. When is the right time? I can't say that. So if you just have an idea, I think it's probably a bit too early. And I also believe that there's a good value that young companies have some development, process development, as well as product development capabilities themselves. And I would recommend that this is always non-GMP at the beginning. There is no, from my perspective, sense in starting that adventure a bit too early, because, you know, it gives you handcuffs in your development work. So start that a little bit later. Working with CMOs, experienced CMOs can start, from my perspective, very, very early on, when you have a bit more than an idea, when you have already a certain process flow, when you can, you know, generate ideas very early on with your partners. So from my perspective, do that very, very early. But I never worked for a startup company, right? So I'm more from the other side. Worked for CMOs and for larger corporations. And again, what I've experienced is that smaller companies very often came, in my opinion, too late rather than too early.
Thank you. Ryan?
Yeah. So the question of when, the answer is depends, unfortunately, and because there's just such a broad spectrum. Yeah, that's right. And so since this is where the conversation is around early stage innovation, for us, we can start with an idea, and we have a venture studio that we're a critical part of. It's called General Innovation, and we get involved at the pre-seed stage. So an inventor or a technologist, scientist, engineer has an idea. We will fund it at a pre-seed state, and then we keep the technologist or the inventor focused on the tech, and we do everything else: incorporation, IP. We build development plans. We plug you into the incubator at Agility Labs. We get you a relationship with Triple Ring to do the de-risking. And so we can go very, very early. But then later than that, if you already have a team around the idea or a company formed, when do you engage? The idea is to de-risk the technology, de-risk the idea, and stabilize the design. And then get it onto, you know, through development and onto the factory floor and into the market. So the when is like now, and not only, but you need to be appropriate for the state that the technology sits, and then be thinking of the next 1 or 2 steps down the road. So, and then, you know, this is an amazing time to be innovating and to be building product, because in North America and Europe, in other areas, it's incredibly open, incredibly collaborative. Everybody has friends, everybody has partners that have done stuff before, and we're all very open to talking and giving advice and helping out, whether or not it turns into work for us or our friends. We're here to push innovation along. And so it's relatively easy to find information these days and to find good channels that you can do all this stuff. So short answer is when? Now.
All right, thank you. I want to switch into talking a little bit about the concerns that companies have when they approach this process. One of the big ones being IP. So what are some of the ways to manage IP when working with an external partner, and what are some available models to split IP or to handle IP? Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking for Triple Ring, we keep it really easy. If we are under contract working for a company, they own everything. And at this stage of development, at stage of the game, there's invention constantly. You know, any project that runs more than 4 or 8 weeks is going to have something that's worthwhile in the IP domain. We have a really simple process of a disclosure form, because we're all steeped in the domains that we're working in. We know what's cutting edge. We know what's novel. We'll quickly jot it down in our notes, hand it to the customer, to the client, and then they do with it what they will. We assign all IP over. So it's very simple. However, if they're in the market, there are ways of leveraging that value. And if you wanted to partner with it, you can use that, the IP as a tool for getting strategic and finding ways of increasing your runway if you're swapping IP and this type of stuff. So does that help? Does that answer the question? Or
no, it does. It does. I wanted to ask actually, Oliver, from the other side of it, as you said, Oliver, you are looking at it from the perspective of the bigger companies rather than the startups.
We always looked at the value of a technology, through the IP glasses as well. Is it valuable IP? Is it protected? Do you have freedom to operate? Is there any chance to file more IP? So that is very important when you look at smaller companies. There are also elements that are difficult to protect. That are not, you can grant a patent on a certain technology, but it might also be that this is crucial for the technology. It might be a certain aspect of manufacturing, a certain trick here or there. And there we need, of course, to look at the way that this know-how is protected, other than through patents or filed IP. That is a second part. The way that IP is generated in co-development or co-manufacturing agreements is, like Ryan said, it usually is owned by the client, by the company that owns the technology, right? And if there are co-development agreements in the contract that you can share IP later on, and this is of course beneficial for the CMO, but not very usual. Normally the IP is owned by the client.
Thank you. So thank you for that. I want to ask a little bit about cost control. So that's another thing, another concern that is on companies' mind when they start these kind of ventures. So how do you best control the costs when you start working with a partner or a co-development partner? And what are the things that you can do to make sure that this doesn't get out of hand, basically? Oliver, go ahead.
What kind of cost are you talking about? The cost for the development service, or the cost of the product at the end of the day, the target cost
I think
of instruments and consumables and reagents and so on? Or what are you referring to? Because you can have a very good budget at the beginning, and you control your costs in your cooperation with your partner, and you end up with an instrument that is by far too expensive for the market, or reagents that can't be sold that easily. So controlling costs has, from my perspective, two elements. One is the project itself, and the other one is that you need to define target cost for your application, for your product. And this is something that you have to share with your partner, and you better invest a little more money in the project phase in order to keep the cost down long term and get a competitive product at the end of the day. So how do you do that? I think it's, again, a question of trust and transparency. So at the beginning, you define target costs defined by the market. They should be mutually agreed upon with the partner at some stage. And then during development, you need to go through these cost calculations again and again and make, for instance, a value engineering phase. What I've done as well is what we call the design to value phase at the very beginning of a collaboration project, where we looked at the product from the customer perspective and said, what is really the value in this product and what is the customer willing to pay? And that defines, of course, already the cost position. And this is then the target for a project and can be then defined between the parties. Or are you referring more to the project cost? How do you control that?
I think both. I think the question is for both. But from your experience, does it usually stay on target? Are there unexpected costs that companies should expect or define in advance?
Yeah, as I said, if you talk about the project, then you can define certain budgets.
But for the
I think
product.
Ryan mentioned that earlier. It's very difficult to define performance targets at the beginning because there are a lot of technical risks. So you start with time and material. You, of course, need to trust your partner that they give you the right numbers. And at a certain point of time, I think you then can come into a different phase of cooperation, and then product cost or cost per test point or something is what really counts at the end of the day, and you can find agreements with your development partner to both work towards the same objective.
Thank you. Same question for Ryan.
Yeah, it's really important, and we spend a huge amount of time on this, a ton of effort, because this is where things can get tricky. And so we have there's this iron triangle of scope, budget, and schedule, and we set up. Our groups have project charters that are developed and shared with the client. Where we outline exactly what the scope is for a given chunk of work. And on that, just as an aside, start small. And that's typically what we do, especially for new clients, is we do something that's relatively low risk, a small few weeks, 6-8 weeks job that is not super expensive. And then you figure out how each other works and kind of work through the kinks, because there's always going to be some. So yeah, I would say scope is really important. Have it pretty constrained, and with deliverables at the back end. So plan it all out. Then check in. So we do weekly meetings when things are running hot. We'll meet almost daily, and you've got to get the inputs from the R&D or from the engineering work and to make quick decisions, because if you delay on decisions, things can begin to wander. So you got to be snappy, and groups like ours will help you with that. But you can get problems by not making quick decisions. And it's okay to stop if you need time to think through a decision. And we're flexible about that kind of thing too. If the data shows something that indicates some assumptions were incorrect about requirements or the current state of the technology, put a pause on it, go through the data, and make decisions to redirect, just like you would if you had your own 50-person company. You have that kind of control over these things. And then always keep in mind, a rule of thumb, a good way to contain cost on time and materials is to constrain the time. So make things go quickly, and that'll save you dollars. Don't go too quickly, because you don't want to don't want to go short on the job, but it's a good tactic.
Great advice. Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit now to talk about outside of the consideration of whether you do it in-house or with a partner. Talk a little bit about product development and manufacturing in general. How do you start with small scale manufacturing? I know it's a complex question, but for a startup that
small scale manufacturing of what? So again, there are different things. Like if you talk about, for instance, instruments, start with a small series of instruments, alpha, beta, and so on, prototypes. That's a completely different thing compared to starting a small scale manufacturing process for reagents or for consumables, plastic parts, or lab on a chip devices. I always recommend to start non-GMP. I always start manual operations. A lot of data need to be generated at the beginning, so be very clear here that every data point needs to be saved somewhere. Try to define the architecture of data at the very beginning, that you have access to that data in later phases. Don't go too early into automation. be a little bit cautious with scale-up factors. So if you have know-how in a certain scale, don't go further than, let's say, a factor of 10 to 15. Don't go to a factor of 100 because effects are completely different in larger scale compared to small scale. Try to always match smaller scale with larger scale, that you can utilize a smaller scale later on to model what's going on in larger scale at affordable pricing for experiments. And try to build an own process development team that is not looking at the product, but it's looking at the manufacturing and all the analytical processes. I also recommend to do a side-by-side development of the manufacturing processes and the analytical methods, because they depend on each other. Without a good know-how about the way that you analyze your process, you can't really you don't know what's going on in your process if you don't have the good analytical methods in place. So start small, start manual, don't go too early into automation. Limit your work to the real important things. Work with companies that have more experience in certain things that are not absolutely important for your product. And try to structure your data that you generate.
I'm going to piggyback on that question with Oliver just a little bit before we move to Ryan, just to ask you sort of an add-on to that. When is the right time to start thinking about a quality management system? When is it too early? And how do you do this without really impeding on the process?
Yeah, quality management has a certain sense, right? It's not only paper. Quality management includes a lot of rules that are absolutely necessary, that are good engineering practices. If you do not calibrate your sensors, if you don't document what you are doing in a proper way, you lose a lot of information and you generate maybe misleading data. So certain procedures like working with qualified equipment, writing protocols and so on, calibrate your equipment, your sensors and so on. That is something that you should try to implement very, very early on, that you have reliable data. Whether or not this needs to be in a complete quality management system is a different question. And then I would recommend to start not too complicated. Start with a 9001, 13485, maybe at a later point. And don't overshoot. So quality management is, of course, something that is required, that the authorities want to see. You also have to document your data in a proper way, and you have to work under a certain quality management system in order to get your products to the market. However, I would really start with what I would call good engineering practices at the beginning. I would start to implement the meaningful procedures step by step, and then establish a full-blown quality management system. When a certain maturity is reached, when is that? Probably when you do the development close to being on the market. There you definitely need something in place already. When is that? It depends. Not too early, not too late. I don't think that I have a good answer. Do it after 3 years, or do it when you have a certain size, or start to do the meaningful things and then try to implement the bureaucracy as late as possible. That would be my advice.
Thank you. These are really excellent points. Ryan, to you.
Yeah, I'll echo what Oliver said, working backwards on that question. Don't overburden the process too early with the quality system. But you also need to avoid making expensive mistakes. If you don't have good engineering practices, you don't document well, or you're not under control, it's going to bite you in the end when the time comes to go to the regulators. and you end up in these very lengthy, expensive archaeological,
Yeah,
study.
working backwards through lab books and so on. Yeah.
So very pragmatically, we find that when we're at the late stages of development and facing the clinic and facing FDA, the overhead for the full quality system is on the order of, I'd say 12 to 18% of a given project budget. Before that, it should be, very, very low overhead. But in our groups, everything we do is in regulated environments, nearly everything. And so it's native to us to document in this way, to have the procedures in place so that it can be adapted very quickly to a quality system. In fact, we have adaptable quality systems that we use that we can impart, or we use the clients, not going to, but it's got to be on your mind. You got to do it just kind of at a low burn. Don't overburden yourself with it at the early stages, but also don't neglect it. And then the part about small scale manufacturing, which is where this kind of conversation got started. It's really important to understand that the funding cycle and the startup business realities most often warp a proper product development program. So what we say is that you be sometimes forced into a design cul-de-sac in order to get the next round of funding, or in order to prove out a very key bit of the technology or the approach, so that you can then get the funds and the backing to go on to the next bit. So you're constantly trading off closing knowledge gaps versus immediately building some stable design that might not meet market needs or requirements. And then you're really in an expensive pickle. Small scale manufacturing, you want to do it in a rational way that helps you to close knowledge gaps, to de-risk very specific questions. Do that as quickly and as cheaply as you can. Do not reinvent wheels. And then once you know these things, then you go work on the stable design. So we use folks like Proto Labs, which is rapid prototyping, for diagnostics, organ-on-chip stuff, or even housings and things like this, or small mechanical parts. You generally, you should get your development partner, your early development partner, to bring you through alpha at a minimum, usually into beta. And so we do a lot of what we call now, folks call a minimum viable product. Keep that with your R&D group. Because trying to get it into a manufacturing group or somebody who's going to manufacture this, ultimately doing that too early, it is more often a disaster than not. Manufacturers need requirements, they need specifications, they need to know what to do. If there's any design work that needs to get done, they call you up and say it does not compute, and you got to go backwards, and that's expensive. So you need to be smart about these things.
Yeah, if I may add one or two sentences to that, Ryan, I think there is a certain value if you involve the manufacturing people even in early stages, because manufacturability of a product is something that you need at a later point of time. So if you want to apply certain technologies, you might need to make some design changes, but only coming from the stakeholder requirements defined by manufacturing. So if you don't consider the input that is coming from that end, you might experience low yields, high costs, quality defects at the end of the day, and then you make a loop very late when the product might be already under change control, and you have to turn a much bigger wheel than involve the manufacturing guys at the beginning and try to listen what their requirements are and try to channel that into the design of the product.
Yeah, and if I may, that's really an important point. You do want to get your manufacturer looking at things early and advising on manufacturability. That's so critical. There's it's not easy. We keep saying, it's all of the above, but it's really true. And so we're very close partners with a group called Evolve Manufacturing in Fremont here in California. We have a shared NPI lab. They're over at our place all the time. We're at their place all the time, and just kind of consulting over what kind of, where's this project now, and what are you, this is going to kill you on the floor for this reason. You should design that out today, kind of thing. And you want to have those interactions as early as you can. But again, don't put yourself into a cul-de-sac or into a bind on things.
Thank you. These are I think really great points and important points. Let's jump from that to kind of what are the biggest mistakes you've seen startups make in this process when starting manufacturing, whether with a partner or in-house, and what can they do to avoid it?
Who starts?
Go ahead, Ryan. Go ahead.
Go for it.
Big mistakes. Yeah, there's so we're talking about early stage innovation in startups. I mean, there's so many ways to make mistakes, not just in the development, but also in the structure of the companies. And so I would even outside of product development, make sure that the company is solid, that the founders are together and aligned, the investors are as well, and that the support network around it is super solid. Because things blow up when the team isn't tight. And then there's, you could have the best idea in the world and it won't see the light of day. For the development work and manufacturing, setting proper expectations on both sides of the transaction or the equation or the partnership. What do you expect to be delivered for what price, and can it be done? Getting misaligned on that causes mistakes in the design, and then also overruns. Don't try to be realistic about the current state of the technology. We're all under pressure to sell the idea and sell the maturity of the feasibility of it, or the data, as high as we can go, so that we can get more funds to push it along at better terms. But eventually that can come back to bite you, because if things the requirements are not well set up in the front, or not well understood what the needs are in the market, groups like ours will go to work and you show up 2 months down the road and says, that detector is running 100x too slow to capture the data that you need, or to check on the biology you need. And in fact, there are no components on the planet today that will satisfy that requirement. So you get into mistakes like that. And one other mistake is never try to break the laws of physics.
Yeah,
This makes sense. Go ahead, Oliver.
Yeah, one mistake is also that people sometimes forget what the customer is really willing to pay for. So I've seen R&D teams that were really focusing on things that they wanted to develop, the problems they wanted to solve, but at the end of the day, that was not really the core point, because they might have optimized something that was not really a valuable feature of a product, and the problems were elsewhere. So I think this design to value, design to to market is something which is very important to define early on, and keep on tracking, because the market might develop in a certain direction, and all of a sudden that product needs to look different, right? And then you have to react fast. So always try to have an eye on the application that you want to develop a product for. And then the other things I see sometimes is what we mentioned already: investment too early in stainless steel and bricks and stones, in building factories, and invest in automation, although the processes are not completely developed. And then you have to turn a much bigger wheel, bringing your technology forward, or you end up with something that has low yields or quality issues and those things. So don't go too far in your investment. Work with partners and keep an eye on the market, keep an eye on customers' expectation, and try to design your product in a certain direction that has the right features for the application.
Thank you. I want to end on the first hour in the live stream on a positive note. So if either one of you could provide a real life example of a product concept through commercialization in your organization. It doesn't have to, you don't have to name names, of course, just kind of a description of a process from end to end.
Sure. Can I start? Real quick.
Go ahead.
So the company's called Hound Labs, Hound like the dog. And this is a cannabis breathalyzer platform for law enforcement and employment applications. And that technology came to us almost 4 years ago now as a lab notebook from one of the universities. And the idea is to be able to detect Delta-9 THC, the psychoactive component or cannabinoid in marijuana, detect Delta-9 THC in breath at the picograms per liter level. So high sensitivity breath-based analysis. And so that was napkin sketch. It's like, here's the idea, here's some chemistry, go build us boxes that we can put into police cruisers as fast as you can. And so we have been the engineering and R&D muscle behind that company for now 4 years. They'll launch the first generation this year, and then very quickly follow with the next. They've gone through many rounds of financing. We've been with them through the whole thing and have invested the whole way, and all the twists and turns. So it's a complex system. It's a breath capture device, snaps into a chemistry set in a box, and then there's a microfluidic disposable. All of that was invented with the client and with Triple Ring, and is now ready for sale very soon.
Thank you. That's a great example. Oliver.
I was thinking about a company, and what came to my mind is a technology that we developed in Miltenyi when COVID came. We thought, what is it that we can do as Miltenyi Biotec to help in that crisis, because we are not manufacturing therapeutics or vaccines or something. Mm-hmm. So we thought about developing a technology to look at cellular immune response. And we started the development of certain peptide mixes. We have built a task force that looked into that. We worked with several hospitals in Germany. And we developed very fast that peptide mix that was launched in, what was that, April 2020, May 2020. So very soon after, the first wave came up. And then we were approached by the Federal Ministry of Health here, whether we can develop that into an assay that helps to detect cellular immunity, because it's clear in COVID that the antibodies disappear after a certain period, but the immune response of the body might still be there because you have this B cell immunity. And we were able to then develop a workflow that consisted of certain instruments that we put in a row in order to detect cellular immune response very fast. And that was launched then only 8 months after the first COVID cases were published. So I think we have been very successful, and we launched that and sold 10 of these workflows into labs here in Germany. And that helps now companies that want to investigate how good their vaccines are working and helps you to analyze the long-term immune response of humans. And that was, of course, a good project. It was not a small company. It was, part of a larger corporation, but it was a good sign because we dedicated a lot of resources to that. We were supported by the government. We received funds, and we were able to develop that workflow super fast and launch the platform very fast. So not really a success story of a young startup company, but maybe a good example of how you can develop something in short notice if you get the right team on board, if you have a good target, if you have the support from the government as well. So that was very successful.
Thank you. It's a great perspective, I think. And thank you, both of you. I want to thank both of you for joining us. We'll now turn off the live stream and continue with a lot more questions that we have from our cohort companies. So Catherine, you can turn off the live stream now. Thank you again for joining us, everyone on the live stream. And thank you, Ryan and Oliver.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah,
all right.
It was a pleasure.
All right.